A deliberate red marking inside La Pasiega cave in northern Spain may be more than 64,000 years old. If that proposed minimum age is correct, the lines were already on the limestone thousands of years before Homo sapiens are generally accepted to have entered Western Europe. The most likely makers would have been Neanderthals. That possibility presses against an older boundary in human history. Neanderthals were once placed firmly outside the world of sustained visual or symbolic behavior. Yet at La Pasiega, a deliberate arrangement of pigment appears to stand on the wrong side of that divide. The implication is difficult to ignore. But the red color itself was not directly dated. Scientists measured a mineral crust associated with the marking. If that calcite securely formed over the pigment, then the red lines must be older. If the physical relationship is less certain, the age of the mineral may not establish the age of the marking beneath it. This is why La Pasiega remains both powerful and disputed. The scientific measurement may be precise, while the archaeological sequence still demands interpretation. A date alone cannot identify an artist, and Neanderthal authorship depends on the proposed age holding and on the human population believed to have occupied the region at the time. Even so, the problem does not disappear. If the association is correct, a visually deliberate mark existed in Western Europe before Homo sapiens arrived there. If it is not, the cave still reveals how easily geology can obscure the boundary between a prehistoric act and the mineral processes that followed. Then another cave added a human outline to the same contradiction. At Maltreviso Cave in western Spain, researchers examined a red hand stencil associated with a proposed minimum age greater than 66,000 years. Someone placed a hand against the limestone. Pigment was applied around it. When the hand was removed, the body vanished, but the spread of its fingers remained. The image preserves an action with unusual immediacy. A person selected a surface, positioned the body, and created a visible absence where the hand had been. Its chronology depends on the same disputed relationship between pigment and mineral deposit. The stencil was not directly dated, and the proposed age is not universally accepted. But if the mineral layer genuinely formed over the image, then the hand-shaped mark would also belong to a period before the accepted arrival of Homo sapiens in Western Europe. Even then, the stencil cannot explain itself. It cannot securely be called a signature, portrait, ownership mark, greeting, or ritual image. It preserves the physical act of making a distinction on the wall, not the meaning attached to that act. La Pasiega presents a geometric form. Maltreviso preserves the outline of a body. Neither alone settles the question. A third cave makes the pattern harder to dismiss as one isolated event. At Ardales Cave in southern Spain, red pigment appears on natural cave formations rather than in a conventional picture. Researchers have argued that at least some of the color was deliberately applied. More importantly, some areas may represent more than one episode of application. If that interpretation is correct, people did not simply leave a single mark and disappear. They returned. A selected formation may have retained importance across separate visits. Color may have been added again to the same natural feature. The surviving evidence cannot reveal whether the reason was practical, visual, social, symbolic, or some combination of purposes that no longer fit modern categories. Repetition does not prove ritual or religion. But it changes the scale of the question. The mystery is no longer confined to one disputed line or one hand-shaped image. It becomes a pattern of decisions, choosing pigment, approaching a particular surface, positioning the body, distinguishing one formation from the stone around it, and perhaps returning to that place later. This is where the older question begins to fail. The issue is not simply whether Neanderthals painted recognizable animals like the famous cave artists who came much later. Symbolic or socially meaningful behavior was never required to resemble a horse, a bison, or any image a modern viewer can immediately identify. A chosen color can make one surface different from another. A hand can connect a body to a place. A natural formation can be selected, altered, and revisited. None of these actions automatically proves art in the modern sense. But neither can they be dismissed merely because their meaning is no longer visible. The deeper investigation is whether some Neanderthal groups deliberately created visual distinctions that mattered within their own communities. Did they select color for more than immediate utility? Did particular surfaces attract repeated attention? Could a mark, a body outline, or a treated formation be recognized by others as significant even when archaeology can no longer recover why? The cave walls cannot answer those questions alone. Their most dramatic dates remain disputed, and a fixed marking preserves only part of a behavior. Archaeologists can examine pigment, mineral layers, location, form, and sequence. They cannot follow a wall image after its maker leaves the cave. They cannot know whether the same people carried related materials elsewhere, handled them repeatedly, attached them to other objects, or displayed them before others. Portable evidence preserves a different trail. Marine shells associated with pigments could be selected, carried, opened, or used as small containers. Bird parts containing little food could be removed and retained for reasons unrelated to ordinary butchery. Colorants could be transported away from their source. Eagle talons could preserve cuts, polish, abrasion, and notches after the cord, hide, fiber, or other material once touching them had vanished. None of these traces provides a complete object. An opening does not prove suspension. Polish does not prove jewelry. A notch does not reveal what was attached. Pigment cannot identify the surface on which it was finally used. But portable artifacts preserve something cave walls cannot: repeated contact across time and movement through human hands. They record selection, modification, transport, and use. The strongest evidence may therefore emerge not from one masterpiece, but from several incomplete actions converging on the same problem. A material was noticed. It was chosen from alternatives. Its form was preserved or deliberately changed. It was carried, handled, or placed where its appearance could remain visible. That still does not reveal religion, language, identity, status, or a symbolic system identical to that of Homo sapiens. The original significance remains lost. Yet the surviving pattern is increasingly difficult to reduce to food, shelter, or ordinary tool production alone. The caves create the contradiction. The portable objects may reveal how far it extends. To move beyond the contested walls of Spain, the evidence must be followed into the objects Neanderthals could take with them. At Krapina, in present-day Croatia, archaeologists recovered 8 curved talons from white-tailed eagles in a Neanderthal context approximately 130,000 years old. Several preserve cut marks. Across the assemblage, researchers have also identified smoothing, polish, abrasion, notches, and areas of wear. No cord survives between them, and no complete ornament reveals how they were once used. Yet the repeated treatment of several similar objects has led to a careful proposal: the talons may have been arranged together, attached, bound, or suspended. That configuration remains an archaeological interpretation, not a proven reconstruction. A white-tailed eagle talon keeps its distinctive form after separation from the bird. It narrows into a hooked point, with a curved outer surface unlike an ordinary fragment of bone. But archaeology cannot declare an object meaningful simply because it appears striking to modern eyes. The argument must begin with the physical traces. Microscopic study examines where the marks occur and whether comparable traces appear across several pieces. Some cuts may record removal from the birds, while concentrated polish, abrasion, and notches may reflect later handling or contact with another material. Natural damage must also be considered. No single mark proves that the talons were attached or bound together. The argument grows stronger because similar modifications recur across an assemblage of 8 selected pieces. One scratch may be ambiguous. A repeated pattern is more difficult to explain as accident. One isolated scratch may be ambiguous. A coherent pattern across an assemblage is a different kind of evidence. The choice of material also matters. Talons contain little nutritional value, and their curved natural forms were not reshaped into ordinary cutting points or scraping tools. This was not a mixed group of bones produced simply by butchery. It was a concentration of the same visually distinctive part from powerful birds, removed and retained without destroying the form that made each piece recognizable. Someone had to notice the claws among the remains. They had to be separated carefully enough to preserve them. Several were kept, altered, and handled long enough for wear to develop. The purpose cannot be recovered. The talons may have been attached to clothing, fiber, hide, a container, a tool, or another object that has vanished. They may have been carried or displayed without being worn on the body. Calling them jewelry is convenient, but too precise. Neither a necklace nor a bracelet can be demonstrated. What survives is concentrated effort directed towards several similar objects that offered little food and no obvious ordinary mechanical advantage. Their appearance may have formed part of their value, even though the nature of that value is lost. Far to the southwest, at Cueva de los Aviones in southeastern Spain, marine shells preserve another part of the investigation. The shells came from a Neanderthal-associated archaeological context and were found in connection with red and yellow color ants. Some possessed openings that could have allowed attachment or suspension. In certain cases, the openings may have been deliberately made or enlarged. In others, a natural opening may have influenced why that shell was selected. An opening permits attachment but does not prove it. Where around its edge can strengthen the possibility that cord, hide, or another material repeatedly pressed against the shell, although the original arrangement remains unknown. Other shells preserve pigment residues interpreted as prepared mixtures. Color adhering to the interior supports the possibility that a shell served as a small container for storing, combining, or handling pigment. Together, the evidence records several distinct behaviors rather than one uniform category of ornament. Marine shells are already unusual when carried away from the shore. Their surfaces reflect light, preserve repeating patterns, and remain recognizable after the animal inside is gone. Some form natural vessels. Others possess openings useful for attachment. Their physical qualities offered several possible reasons for selection. A practical purpose does not exclude a visual one. A shell could have held pigment while also being chosen partly for its appearance. Pigment could assist a technical process, alter a surface, or produce a visible effect. A talon could have been attached to another object without fitting neatly into the modern category of jewelry. The proposed chronology of Cueva de los Aviones makes the evidence especially significant, but the dating must be stated carefully. The shells and pigments were not directly dated to approximately 115,000 to 120,000 years ago. Uranium series measurements were obtained from flowstone capping the archaeological deposit. The material beneath that cap had to be deposited before the flowstone formed, so the dated mineral layer provides a minimum age for the archaeology below it. The proposed chronology therefore depends partly on the integrity and interpretation of the layers. A precise measurement establishes the age of the flowstone, but archaeology must still show that it genuinely sealed the deposit containing the artifacts and that the relationship was not disturbed. That caution limits the claim without erasing the evidence. The shells, openings, colorants, and residues remain part of a Neanderthal-associated context. Whatever the final chronological refinement, they still record deliberate collection and use that cannot be reduced to the accidental presence of shellfish. Crepina and Cueva de los Aviones preserve different portions of a behavioral sequence. The talons record selection, removal, modification, and repeated contact. The shells preserve collection, pigment preparation, possible containment, and traces relevant to attachment. No artifact preserves every stage. Yet both assemblages show that particular materials were chosen from alternatives, transported or altered, and sometimes handled repeatedly. Their importance lies not in whether they resemble modern jewelry, but in the deliberate decisions surrounding them. Mineral pigments provide supporting evidence, although color alone cannot prove symbolic behavior. At Neanderthal sites, colorants were sometimes selected, transported, ground, rubbed, shaped, or repeatedly used. These actions can leave worn surfaces, scraped facets, powder, and residues. A naturally occurring lump near its geological source carries one kind of evidence. Material transported elsewhere and worked repeatedly preserves a more complex history. Pigment may have helped process a practical material, altered a surface, or created a visible effect. Several functions could overlap. Its significance depends on context, where it was found, how it was prepared, and what other objects were associated with it. Bird remains present a similar problem of indirect survival. At some sites, cut marks appear on claws, wings, or other parts containing little meat. Their placement has been interpreted as consistent with the deliberate removal of feathers, talons, or visually distinctive elements. The feathers themselves normally decay. Their possible use must therefore be approached through marks on the bones beside the places where they were attached. Repeated cuts in anatomically relevant locations may support deliberate removal, but they do not prove elaborate feathered clothing or ceremonial costumes. What survives is the act of separation, not the final form. This is why the archaeological record is uneven. Fiber, hide, feathers, wood, and cord disappear far more readily than shell, mineral, bone, or talon. The most visible parts of prehistoric objects may have vanished, leaving only the durable pieces that were attached to them. The word symbolic must therefore be used with restraint. It does not automatically mean religious, ceremonial, or artistic. Here, it describes the possibility that an object's importance depended partly on shared recognition, association, memory, display, or communication. The talons and shells may have participated in such practices, but their specific meanings cannot be recovered. The evidence shows that appearance and arrangement could be noticed. It cannot reveal exactly what an observer understood. That possibility changes older comparisons between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Long before the famous painted caves of Western Europe, Homo sapiens communities in Africa were collecting and processing pigments, engraving ochre with repeated geometric marks, and transporting perforated marine shells interpreted in some contexts as personal ornaments. This evidence challenges a Europe-centered story in which symbolic behavior appeared suddenly with spectacular cave painting. Repeated marking, pigment preparation, and the selection of portable objects had deeper roots elsewhere. The Neanderthal evidence complicates the narrative further. Modified eagle talons, pigment-associated shells, selected bird parts, and transported colorants suggest that sustained attention to visible materials was not exclusive to a single population arriving in Europe at one moment. The comparison works most securely at the level of observable behavior. Researchers can compare deliberate selection, transport, modification, repeated marking, and possible attachment or display. A perforated shell associated with Homo sapiens and a modified talon associated with Neanderthals may both preserve attention to portable, visible objects. That similarity can support comparable behavioral capacities while leaving the cultural traditions behind those objects entirely distinct. Similar archaeological traces do not prove identical mental or social worlds. Engraved ochre, prepared pigment, perforated shells, and altered animal parts cannot establish identical beliefs, languages, traditions, or systems of identity. Nor do they show that one population copied the other. The evidence should not be turned into a contest over which population invented art first. The record is too incomplete, and the category itself is too modern. The oldest surviving example is rarely the first example ever made. Organic artifacts disappear. Coastal sites are submerged. Open-air settlements erode. Excavation reveals only a fraction of the places once used, and preservation favors certain materials while removing others entirely. Archaeology therefore reconstructs missing actions through their physical consequences. Concentrated polish on a talon may record repeated contact with a binding that has decayed. Cut marks on a bird bone may preserve the removal of feathers after the feathers themselves have disappeared. Where around a shell opening may indicate movement or attachment after cord or fiber has vanished. Pigment residue may remain after the body, hide, tool, container, or surface to which it was applied is gone. Archaeologists do not directly observe those missing materials. They infer their possible presence from effects left on the objects that survived, pressure concentrated along an edge, polish in a restricted area, cuts placed beside an attachment point, or color trapped inside a shell. The absent material remains hypothetical, but its former interaction with the artifact can become the explanation that best fits the physical pattern. Each clue is incomplete, but it narrows the range of explanation. Researchers compare the position and concentration of marks, the relationship between objects, their archaeological context, and the likelihood that natural processes alone could have produced the observed pattern. A shell can possess a natural opening, yet where around that opening may help explain why it was selected. Pigment occurs in nature, yet transport, preparation, and residue inside a shell point toward deliberate use. Bone can be scratched accidentally, yet repeated modification across several eagle talons demands more than an accidental explanation. From such traces, archaeology can recover part of what people did. It can identify selection, removal, modification, contact, and repeated use. It can show that attention was directed toward materials whose value extended beyond immediate nutrition or ordinary tool production. It can sometimes demonstrate that appearance and association were involved in the treatment of an object. But reconstructing an action is not the same as recovering its meaning. The curve of a talon, the colored interior of a shell, or polish left by a vanished binding can reveal how an object was treated. They cannot reveal what passed between the people who made, carried, or observed it. That missing social world becomes the next part of the investigation. What capacities were required not merely to alter an object, but to preserve a practice, recognize its importance, and pass it to others? On the laboratory table, the evidence is almost silent: a talon marked by a cut, a shell with an opening, a narrow band of polish, a trace of pigment trapped against an ancient surface. The people who handled these objects are gone, along with the gestures and explanations that once surrounded them. Yet deliberate selection, transport, modification, and repeated contact point beyond the material itself. They suggest attention, memory, planning, and perhaps an awareness that other people could notice what had been chosen. A talon, shell, or piece of pigment becomes archaeologically significant when it enters a pattern of deliberate choices. It may be selected, transported, modified, retained, or repeatedly handled even when its precise purpose is lost. The question is therefore no longer what these objects meant. It is what capacities were necessary for people to treat them in these ways. Selection begins with attention. Among many fragments, one form must be noticed as different. A person preserving a talon or collecting a shell must retain that distinction long enough to act. Transport requires the object to remain relevant after leaving the place where it was found. Modification requires an understanding that its form can be changed. Preparation implies a future use that may not occur immediately. These actions can involve memory of a source, anticipation of a later task, and the ability to connect present effort with an intended result. A shell holding a prepared mixture suggests more than momentary curiosity. Several similarly treated talons suggest repeated attention rather than accidental contact. Neither provides a complete map of cognition, but converging patterns make the simplest explanations less convincing. Still, deliberate action by one individual is not the same as a shared convention. A person might collect an unusual object for reasons understood by no one else. Archaeology would preserve the object but not its private significance. For it to function as a recognized display, reminder, signal, or element of belonging, other people would need to respond to it in some partly shared way. Those observers are invisible in the archaeological record. Their gaze leaves no deposit. Their gestures do not fossilize. Researchers therefore look for persistence, similar material selected more than once, comparable treatments applied across several objects, or practices repeated through time. Repetition does not prove a formal tradition, rank, ceremony, or common belief. It can show that an explanation based entirely on isolated accident is no longer sufficient. Once a behavior persists beyond one moment, the investigation changes. The question becomes not only whether someone could perform it, but how it was learned, remembered, reproduced, and altered by others. Prehistoric knowledge did not require formal instruction. A technique could pass through observation, imitation, participation, gesture, demonstration, correction, and repeated shared activity. Someone could learn how to prepare pigment or modify an object by watching skilled hands and joining the task. Complex practical abilities can be acquired without a complete verbal explanation. But reproducing a movement is not always the same as understanding when it matters. If an object was handled only in particular circumstances, displayed before certain people, or recognized through an association invisible in its material, then the practice required shared memory as well as technical imitation. That possibility leads directly to communication. Artifacts do not preserve spoken words. A modified talon cannot demonstrate grammar. A perforated shell does not prove personal names, storytelling, mythology, or a vocabulary identical to that of living humans. Pigment residue cannot reveal what anyone called the color or how its use was explained. Yet shared practices require information to move between people. If several individuals recognized an object, reproduced a technique, or understood when it should be carried or displayed, communication must have supported that knowledge in some form. Voice may have been part of it. So may gesture, gaze, posture, demonstration, repeated participation, and attention to the reactions of others. Archaeology cannot determine how these channels were combined. Biological evidence keeps complex vocal communication within the range of possibility. Neanderthal vocal anatomy, the form of the hyoid, and genetic evidence involving FOXP2 have contributed to discussions of speech-related capacities. None proves modern language or preserves vocabulary, grammar, or conversation. The artifacts occupy a more cautious middle ground. They belong to practices that required memory, learning, and some means of communication, even though that means cannot be reconstructed. Broader Neanderthal evidence supports this context. Tool production, transported raw materials, composite technologies, and detailed knowledge of animals and terrain required planning, technical learning, and cooperation. Some individuals also survived conditions that may have required sustained assistance from others. Possible deliberate burials add another cautious parallel. Even where intentional placement is likely, the motive remains uncertain and cannot automatically be treated as evidence of religion or an afterlife. Like the portable objects, burial may preserve a deliberate action while withholding its original interpretation. This is why no single behavior can serve as a pass-or-fail test for intelligence or humanity. Older models often searched for a sudden threshold. Art appears, ornaments appear, burial appears, or language appears, and the modern mind is declared to have arrived. But behavior does not enter the archaeological record as one complete package. A capacity may exist without producing durable evidence, and a tradition may appear, weaken, or disappear as social and environmental conditions change. The absence of surviving ornaments cannot prove the absence of display. The presence of one modified object cannot reveal the complete mental life of a population. Yet uncertainty does not make every explanation equally plausible. Selection, transport, preparation, patterned modification, and repeated handling can still be established with considerable confidence even when their social interpretation remains limited. Comparison with early Homo sapiens is strongest at the level of observable behavior. In both populations, particular materials were selected, transported, modified, and sometimes treated repeatedly. These similarities do not establish identical beliefs, languages, or cultural traditions. They do, however, weaken the idea of an absolute behavioral boundary. Human evolution was branching and uneven. Different populations could share capacities while expressing them through different materials and practices. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were not completely separate worlds. Genetic evidence demonstrates interbreeding, but it cannot reveal whether particular practices were exchanged. Similar behaviors may reflect shared ancestry, independent development, contact, or some combination the surviving record cannot separate. Preservation makes that separation even harder. Stone, shell, bone, and mineral pigment may survive while cord, hide, feathers, gestures, movement, and spoken explanations disappear. Missing elements can sometimes be inferred from wear, polish, cuts, or protected residues, but such interpretations must remain controlled by context and repeated patterns. The archaeological record is not a complete sample of Neanderthal behavior. It is the durable remainder of practices that were once much larger than the objects left behind. By this point, the original question has become too simple. Asking whether Neanderthals were capable of symbolism reduces a complex record to a yes or no verdict. More precise questions lead further. Which materials attracted deliberate attention? Which actions were repeated? Which practices may have been socially learned, and how widely were they shared? What forms of communication supported them? Which parts entered the ground, and which disappeared completely? Archaeology can answer some of these questions more firmly than others. It can identify selection, transport, modification, pigment preparation, repeated contact, pattern treatment, and possible attachment. It is far less able to recover the memory attached to an object, the response of an observer, or the explanation that gave the action social force. The evidence does not provide direct access to private thought. It reveals repeated moments in which material was noticed, chosen, changed, prepared, retained, or carried in ways that cannot be reduced easily to food acquisition or ordinary tool production. That is a limited conclusion, but not a small one. It places the talons, shells, and pigment traces inside minds capable of sustained attention and future-directed action. It places them inside communities where techniques could be learned, practices remembered, and objects potentially recognized by more than one person. It does not make Neanderthal culture identical to that of Homo sapiens. It makes the older image of an absolute mental boundary increasingly difficult to maintain. On the laboratory table, the talon still carries polish along its curve. A researcher can examine the surface, locate the cut, measure the wear, and reconstruct the archaeological context. The vanished binding cannot be lifted. The original gesture cannot be replayed. The response of another person cannot be recovered. But the interruption in ordinary material life remains visible. Someone noticed the object. Someone selected it. Someone altered or carried it. And perhaps, when it was seen again, someone else understood that it mattered. The message is gone, but the trace still holds the outline of the human world that made it possible.